Hi, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Ray Machado, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Now is a good time to go ahead and check the volume on your phone or computer and make sure that the audio is coming in loud and clear. To download a copy of today's presentation, you can do so by opening the Handouts tab on the gray panel. Today's presentation, Fire and Life Safety Assessments and Audits. There will be a Q&A session at the end of today's call. You can submit questions at any time throughout the presentation on the right side of your screen. If you don't see the question panel, click on the orange arrow to open it and look for the gray questions bar. Our presenter today is Mark Reinstra. Mark is a senior risk control consultant for Alliant, where he brings 20 years of industry experience and enthusiasm to the risk control services team. His areas of emphasis include property conservation, fleet management, chemical safety, and program development. Mark holds a Bachelor of Science in Occupational Safety from Illinois State University. He's a certified safety professional and also holds an Associate in Risk Management designation. It is now my privilege to turn the program over to Mark.
Thank you, Ray. Excuse me, and thank you all for taking the time out to join us today. Hopefully you had a great holiday season within the parameters that we're faced with, given what's going on in the world. Before we really get into it, I do have to put this disclaimer slide up here for a few seconds. I think our attorney's happy if that is indeed possible. Okay. As we already know, fire losses are not anything new. They've been around for a long time. What's surprising is that it's 2021 and we're still, despite all the knowledge that we have about this particular peril, we're still seeing numbers like this. And this is actually from 2019. It's the most recent data available from the National Fire Protection Association, also known as NFPA. As you can see here, 1.3 million fires nationwide, and still 3,700 deaths. And this is actually only civilian deaths. This does not include firefighter deaths or other non-civilians within that number. Now, what's interesting about, as you look at these numbers here, 1/3, and I'm going to close this window here so I can see. Sorry about that. 1/3 of these fires occurred in structures. So 1/3 of that 1.3 million fires. However, that 1/3 actually accounted for 80 to 84% of these other statistics, so deaths, injuries, property damage, etc. So it really kind of underscores the need to make sure that we have a handle on what's going on within our particular building or structure or structures. Now, most folks, oops, it's not going to advance for me there. Try it again. There we go. Most folks tend, when they think of cause of death pertaining to fire, they think that someone burned to death. And actually, it's actually a fairly small percentage. Most deaths are going to occur from smoke inhalation. And it really kind of underscores some of the focuses of the audits that we're going to be doing. As you may or may not already know, depending on what is actually burning, those materials can give off a variety of airborne toxins. But most folks, if they succumb to death, it's going to be from asphyxiation of some sort, whether it be simple or chemical. So we talk about deaths and injuries from fires, and it really, if that's not compelling enough, it's actually just the tip of the iceberg. So what we refer to when we look at property damage and injuries, and whether that be from a fire accident or really any type of accident, these are really just the direct costs. And as you can see here from this illustration over here on the right of the slide, that is just the tip of the iceberg. There's actually, if we're looking at just the monetary effects, the indirect costs far outweigh the direct costs in terms of monetary value. So it really does compel us to be more prevention oriented and more proactive versus looking for a cure or looking to be reactive. Excuse me. So if we're going to take a look at our fire and life safety audits, really fire safety is fairly simple. As you can see here, it looks to address both life safety, which is the protection of occupants from injury or death, and also to prevent or reduce the chance or effect of property damage. So fortunately, there's a lot of overlap. So for example, if you're going to protect a particular building with fire protection, whether it be a sprinkler system or other feature, this is also going to positively affect your chances of life safety as well. And Ray, I believe we have. Are you able to put the polling question up there? Ray?
Yeah, let me just launch it. Okay, here we go. So the first polling question for today: my company performs fire and life safety audits of our building approximately A, daily, B, weekly, C, monthly, D, semi-annually, or E, not sure. So please respond to the best of your knowledge.
And I apologize. I think that the slide is out of order here. Yep. I apologize. I had a couple different versions of this PowerPoint floating around my desktop, so I apologize for that.
Okay.
Go.
And all right, so I'll go ahead and close the polling question now and read off the results. So the results for that, we had 38% who stated they complete those on a monthly basis, 31% complete those on a semi-annual basis, 19% were not sure, 8% weekly basis, and 4% on a daily basis.
Okay. And the reason I wanted to ask that is there's really not a hard and fast rule as far as how often you perform those. It really comes down to your assessment of the particular hazards in your particular work area. So some general considerations that we want to take into account as we're trying to address both fire safety and life safety is the regular inspection and maintenance of our fire protection systems, making sure that appropriate employee training is conducted, and hopefully you've already implemented some measure of an emergency action plan or fire prevention plan. Usually a lot of the control measures are kind of going to go hand in hand with those particular programs. Now, as you can see down here by the bolded bullet point, the main focus, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road with regard to fire and life safety. These audits allow us to assess whether or not our controls are working and whether or not we need to be making improvements on those controls, whatever those happen to be. And let's see here, and actually that was the polling question out of order there, so I'm going to skip through that. I apologize. So where do we begin? Well, first off, it's if we're going to look at this in a systematic fashion, we kind of want to know, well, where am I going to get the most bang for my buck? Where should I really start my focus? And according to the NFPA, you can see here the top 5 causes of fire nationwide. This is not in any particular order. This is not in order of quantity or dollar amount or deaths or anything like that. We're not going to be talking about all of these, and that is because we actually do have a webinar coming up in a few weeks that's going to address cooking exposures, but we are going to address some of these. And certainly one thing that didn't quite make the top 5 up here, certainly electrical and heating equipment is always in the top 5, it seems like. But on honorable mention also goes to clothes dryers, and there's approximately 15,000 of those every year. And as you might imagine, due to the accumulation of lint in the ducts and lack of regular cleaning. So now that we know, or we have an idea of what the top 5 causes of fire are, how do we go about preventing it? And we, in order to understand how to prevent, we at least need to have a rudimentary understanding of how fire works. And those of you that are not familiar with this is what's referred to as the fire triangle. Some professionals also use a tetrahedron, which is shaped more like a rectangle. But really the effect is still the same here. In order for you to have a fire, you need all 3 of these particular components. If you remove one of the particular components, the fire triangle falls apart. Excuse me. So now that we know that, we move on to building our own safety audits. And some general things to keep in mind as we're building our own audits are really the process that we're looking at is identifying ahead of time both the existing and the potential hazards that we may reasonably foresee. Just like any other audit, it should be documented as well as have a mechanism to effect corrective action. Now, as I already mentioned earlier, the frequency of that particular audit is going to greatly depend on what you've gone ahead and identified. So if we have, for example, an office building where, especially now due to COVID, where we really only have a few people coming in and out of there, there's really not a whole lot of operations, even when we're under normal circumstances, we're probably not going to need to do a life safety audit too often. Now, contrast that with some sort of perhaps a wood manufacturing shop, and you might imagine we have plenty of exposures there, both for ignition and fuel, that we really need to make sure that that someone is held responsible and someone is on top of controlling those particular hazards that we've gone ahead and identified. Now, we can't talk about every single fuel source. There's just too many, but it's important to understand the characteristics of each individual fuel source. So, for example, if we're talking about simply ordinary dry combustibles, typically you might think of wood or paper or something along those lines. Those that are familiar with the different types of fire extinguishers know that this would typically be affected best by a type A fire extinguisher. However, there's not any reason to underestimate it just because it's a dry combustible. As you see over here with this picture, if you have idle pallets, those have been the source of extremely destructive fires in the past. And while they don't look like that combustible, they actually have the real potential to cause some damage. Once they get going, they are very difficult to put out, especially if you have a lot of them, if you have them stacked high, if you have them stacked together. So if we find we have this exposure, we want to take steps to minimize that. Some of the other things that we want to identify, if we have a situation like this over here on the bottom right, where we have tire storage or plastics. Typically, those particular types of combustibles are, while they're fairly difficult to ignite, they're not going to go up with a match. But once they get going, they're extremely difficult to put out. So we want to be cognizant of the risk that particular fuel source presents to us. And lastly, this is a fairly common example, oily rags, and I say oily rags, and it doesn't necessarily have to be oil within those rags. It's probably one of the more common things that we find in shops and other places where this sort of thing is used. But I'm seeing a lot of places that are using things like isopropyl alcohol and other things. It really doesn't have to be oil. They all present a very similar hazard when you get this combustible waste just sitting there. Most folks are not aware that when we get these rags and other combustibles sitting in one place for a while, they actually start to decompose by themselves spontaneously, and that decomposition generates heat. If enough heat is generated, then it's very conceivable that pile of oily rags can ignite, and it has done so in the past. Some of it, what most of us tend to think of when we think of fuel sources are flammable liquids and gas. And I don't want to get too far into this simply because Ray Machado did a webinar strictly on flammable liquid storage and handling. And so I don't want to step on his toes, and I don't want to get too far off topic here. But certainly keep in mind as you do your initial survey to identify these fuel sources that these sorts of things, these flammable liquids and gases cannot be underestimated. As you see here, aerosols are one, and I've seen this for decades now, that for whatever reason, folks tend to underestimate the power that aerosols have. And you know, we all have them in our homes, so perhaps that's the reason why we don't really think of them when we think of dangerous flammable liquids or gases. And in fact, it doesn't necessarily, because they're under so much pressure and because they come out in an aerosol, they don't necessarily have to be that flammable to pose a fire risk. So definitely something to keep in mind. This last picture over here, a very common sight nowadays, especially with everything that's going on in the world. If you find that this is a perfect example of a household item that, especially now that a lot of companies are storing them in bulk, they tend to forget that these chemicals are also flammable, and you get enough of them in one place, and you have a real hazard that's presented to itself. Now, one last thing, for those of you that have food service operations, if you have hand sanitizer within those operations, it's and this is a bit off topic with regard to fire, but if we're looking at our overall safety audits, and hopefully this is simply one component of your own internal audits. If you didn't know this already, if you tended to forget, these hand sanitizers typically are laden with toxins meant to kill those microbes. What people forget is that those toxins can be toxic to us as well. So if you are, and a perfect example would be if you sit down to eat and you sanitize your hands with something like this, and then immediately pick up and grab your burger, you're probably ingesting some of those hand sanitizer toxins. And most of them come with a label that, at least that I've seen, that specify exactly how many minutes those need to be exposed to air. That chemical needs to be exposed to air before it's safe for those and those toxins have dispersed. We couldn't talk about ignition sources without talking about electrical. Certainly one of the most common sources of fire. And again, this is a part of our day-to-day lives. It has been for pretty much our whole lives. And I think this tends to make people forget the dangers that these pose, and not just from a fire standpoint, but also from a physical safety standpoint. So obviously, you know, we talk about we're focusing on the fire aspect of it, but certainly there's always the risk of shock and electrocution as well. These are very common sites, and this is one reason why if you have a fairly large operation, you want to make sure that someone is staying on top of these electrical cords. I see all the time where the extension cords are used as replacements for fixed wiring. Please keep in mind that those extension cords are only meant to be a temporary power source. They're not meant to hold up to day in and day out use. And certainly if over time, those the wear and tear that those sustain can present a very real fire hazard, depending on how much is being pulled through those particular cords. As we can see here, this is perhaps not this bad, but still I see a lot of adapters being used. And anytime you start pulling more current through a wire, whether that be extension cord or fixed wiring, you start pulling more amperage and more current through that wiring that it was meant to sustain. It's going to lead to electrical heating, and if you get enough electrical heating, then you get something like this. Obviously, as we do our audits, identifying damaged electrical parts or components like this, it should be top of the list. We want to make sure that these get addressed as soon as possible. And I can't tell you, I've actually had a few times where I have seen an outlet just like this while walking through a client's buildings, and ask them, hey, it looks like you had a fire here. What happened? And every time I've asked that, if we're being totally honest here, the folks have said, well, I don't know, it's always like that. Okay, so what's the next step now? Do we know if it's working? Do we know if it's compromised? Are we going to replace the damaged component? Why hasn't there been a correction mechanism? So I mentioned before, as we talk about these audits, there has to be some sort of correction mechanism, and hopefully someone who is held responsible for that correction. One thing to keep in mind as you're assessing the load that's placed on these electrical components is the fact that if you have appliances like microwaves, like toaster ovens or refrigerators, these are typically high draw items, meaning that they draw quite a bit of current through those wires. And most building codes, most authorities require that those high draw appliances have their own dedicated circuit. So it's certainly a question to ask. If you see something like this, these two stacked together, and typically if you're looking at a break room, there's usually a full-size fridge in there as well. We want to at least ask the question, hey, are these on the same circuit, or are they on different circuits? Because that could come back to bite us down the road. As we're looking at electrical safety, these are fairly common sites, but very, very easy fix. Face plates and covers are going to not only protect an employee or a visitor from electrical shock, but they prevent or reduce the amount of moisture and dust that is making its way into those electrical components. Also, if there does happen to be some sort of fire in these particular fixtures, then that cover is also going to limit the spread of that fire. Very similar for electrical breakers. What you're looking at here with this middle picture here, it's a little hard to make out, but these are metal clips that someone placed on these electrical breakers, and they're commonly called lock dogs, but essentially the function is so that people don't go ahead and turn off those breakers. Unfortunately, it does also limit the reliability of those breakers tripping. And the whole function of an electrical breaker is it will sense if heat is starting to build up within the wiring or the system that it controls, it will automatically trip and shut off power to that. Now, they just like a lot of mechanisms, they don't always work. I actually had a fire in my first house where not only did the person that installed my microwave put it on the same circuit as my full-size refrigerator, he also the electrical breaker did not trip the way it should have. I did not have any clips like this on there, but for whatever reason, the breaker did not do its job. Now, obviously we want to give our safety devices their best possible chance for helping us. So if we see this, we want to know why. Really, these are the only time that these clips are acceptable, and this I've confirmed this with numerous fire departments and representatives, that really the only time that those are acceptable is if they are used on fire protection components. So for example, if one of these breakers controls our fire alarm, it is then acceptable to most fire departments that clip is present. Typically, they will also require that clip to be colored red so that they can immediately identify that is what that particular breaker controls. Now, as we look at prevention measures, if you recall the fire diamond, really the whole point of these prevention measures is to take away one component of that particular fire triangle. If you take away one of the legs, the rest of it falls down. So we want to, if we find that we have situations like this over on the right, where we have tons and tons of whether they be dry combustibles or flammable liquids, it really doesn't matter. We want to ask the question, hey, do we really need all this? What is this doing here? Why is it not properly stored? And I do ask that question quite a bit of clients, and one of the answers that I get most frequently is that, well, it's been here, it's been like that since I've been here. I don't even know what that stuff is used for. I don't know what it pertains. So, excuse me. We really want to take a fair assessment of what is it that we need. Do we even need all this stuff? And if so, if we don't need it, then we want to make sure it's properly disposed of. We mentioned those oily rags have that potential to spontaneously heat and ignite. These sorts of cans are your best bet to make sure that to keep them from either combusting, because it's obviously, as you can see here, it's self-closing, it's spring-loaded, but as you can see also it's made out of metal, so very sturdy. It's non-combustible, and even if something does happen to start heating up, it's not going to get enough air to really do any sort of damage. Now, we mentioned flammable liquids in the past. Like I said, I'm not going to get too far into that because we do have a separate webinar completely that is pertaining exclusively to that. But we do want, we do want to at least know that proper containers are being used. So gasoline is a good example of things that that we will probably run into, at least on a ancillary basis within our operations. Most places have, at least one or two cans. But what we don't want to see is plastic containers like this without all the safety features that something like this has. And I do get that these are pricier. These are your typical cans that you might get at Walmart or Home Depot, but it stands to reason you do get what you pay for. Those really aren't going to help you much when you're talking about controlling your flammable liquid exposure. When we talk about proper storage, we want to make sure that all the safety components within that storage are actually working properly. So what I mean by that is we look over here at this flammable storage cabinet, which hopefully, if you have these sorts of chemicals on site, that you have a cabinet like this to store it. Hopefully we're only keeping 1 day's worth of those flammable liquids outside of the suitable storage. But the other thing that we want to look for as we're performing our audits are the safety features that something like this comes with. Are they functioning properly? And what I mean by that is, as you look at this cabinet, these cabinets are supposed to be both self-closing and self-latching. As you can see here, the door is standing wide open. I was able to take the picture without having to hold it open. There's actually nobody off camera holding that open. So we want to make sure that gets addressed as soon as possible, because that safety feature is specifically designed so that if any one of those liquids does catch fire, it's going to immediately be contained. Excuse me. And lastly, those of you that are familiar with hazard communication know that all of these have to have to have proper labeling, whether that be these cans here or a secondary container. We're not going to get too far into that, but certainly it bears repeating that as we're doing our audits, that if we see a container that has not been properly labeled as to its identity, as to any hazards that it may have, we want to make sure that that gets addressed. And a perfect example of that would be one of the manufacturing places I was at years ago, where they had a plastic jug just sitting out, and it's clearly being used for some sort of some aspect of their operation, their manufacturing operations. And I asked the person taking me through, hey, what's in this jug? And of course he didn't know. And I'm like, well, it's a clear liquid. The jug is clear, but is it water? Is it isopropyl alcohol? Is it? So if I have a little wastebasket fire and I grab this jug thinking that it's a bottle of water and throw it on there, what's going to happen? And it did actually turn out to be isopropyl alcohol. So so it was a learning moment. Luckily, they hadn't had any incidents up until that point. As we look at prevention, I'm still, to this day, I'm still surprised that smoking is still one of the top 5 causes of fires, especially with every company in a lot of states, or even government locations prohibiting smoking. But that being said, some companies still do have smoking areas. So it's important that if we do have this on site, that we make sure that our policy, whatever that particular policy happens to be, is being adhered to. And as you can see, when I took this picture here, this was actually in the designated smoking area, and they actually had proper disposal available in that smoking area. However, as you can see here, I don't know, maybe you can't, depending on how big your screen is, but someone decided that that the approved disposal wasn't good enough, so they just stuck their cigarette butts in here with the rest of the garbage. Certainly, this is certainly an unnecessary risk for really any company out there, and it's probably a reason why a lot of companies have gone the route of completely prohibiting smoking on company grounds, in addition to all the health hazards that go along with that. This is certainly a place I'm finding when, depending on the particular company, the particular situation, for whatever reason, they either don't have a fire extinguisher nearby, or that somebody has taken that fire extinguisher and is using it for a doorstop. It's really not where it should be. We want to make sure that we have proper fire protection to put out something like this. And again, if we see stuff like this, this is just an accident waiting to happen, and it's completely unnecessary. It's completely not a part of most of our particular operations. We couldn't talk about prevention without talking about proper maintenance, and certainly most of us are aware of maintenance that needs to be done on fire protection. Certainly, with buildings being only partly occupied due to COVID, or perhaps completely shut down, it certainly bears repeating that making sure that proper maintenance is being performed on the fire protection systems. I'm actually finding quite a few places where the fire protection maintenance has lapsed. The tags are out of date, and that's due directly to the fact that they were shut down, nobody was there, or their contractor was not able to get in, or that contractor themselves were shut down. So there's a lot of different factors that could possibly play into that. If we're talking about heat producing equipment, this could be anything from boilers to hot water heaters to furnaces. We want to make sure that our preventative maintenance is being performed on schedule, and that issues are corrected immediately. Stuff like this, again, very easy to head off before they happen, but we need to make sure that we're doing our due diligence. I did mention honorable mention for the dryer fires. Again, roughly 15,000 every year, and this is a really simple fix. I'm I haven't come across too many places that aren't aware of this. Typically, if they aren't aware of it, it's because that dryer is really kind of an incidental aspect to their operations. They really hadn't thought to consider that as a possible fire source for their building, for their operations. But as you can see here, it can and does happen. Space heaters, this is a big one, and you know, I see it pretty much every office I go into. I can usually find at least one space heater that somebody has either snuck in, or nobody has really thought to address it. And so if we haven't gone the route of addressing that yet, we want to make sure that is done. We want to decide whether we want to prohibit these sorts of things completely, or if we're going to limit their use. And by that I mean making sure that anybody who brings a space heater in is going to have the appropriate safety features of a modern appliance. So they're not bringing in something like, as you can see here, this looks like a pretty old space heater here. I don't know, maybe something from the 1960s or 50s, especially based on the furniture in the background there. That's not going to have the tip over features and the shutoff features that that modern appliances are going to have. We also want to make sure that if we allow them, that if they're not going to be attended, that they are shut off, they're unplugged, etc. Okay. One of the last aspects of fire prevention is making sure that our fire separations have not been compromised. And if you recall, earlier in the presentation, we mentioned that the main cause of death from fire is actually smoke inhalation, not from the fire itself. And these fire separations are also meant to be smoke barriers. So these are things that we want to make sure are intact. They are not compromised. Very easy to do, especially now. A lot of buildings, if they go through upgrades, if they go through renovations, they have contractors on site running conduit and pipe and wiring through the buildings. But most folks don't understand that those contractors don't seal up their openings. That's typically done by a contractor that specializes in that sort of thing. And they actually, the caulk and the sealant that they use is actually fire rated to prevent to prevent the spread of that fire. Now, one last thing, as we talk about smoke spread, it certainly bears emphasizing that not only is that smoke dangerous to humans, if we have, most of us have, at least to some extent, some valuables, whether that be computer servers or other forms of data or electronic devices. Typically, the fires that take place in modern fires are going to be very destructive to that sort of thing. So again, it underscores why these are so important. Door stops are a big one. If and granted, this is probably a picture. We can probably list a few things that's wrong with that picture. But if we have a fire rated door, we want to make sure that that is shut at all times, unless someone is actually doing some work. So for example, most places I go into, I can find those rubber door stops that somebody has just stuck in the fire door and left it. Now it's fine to use those as long as especially if you're loading, unloading, etc. throughout the course of the day. But there needs to be a policy in place that those door stops get removed once that work is done. And certainly now you're starting to rely on human nature to actually follow through with doing what they should be doing. So ideally, if you have this option over here on the right, what you're looking at here, if you haven't had any direct experience with these are magnetic door stops, which are also, these are permissible to use on fire doors, provided they are tied into your fire alarm system or a smoke detector. So if there is a fire, it will kill the power to that magnet, and the door will swing shut on its own. Now, these are things that we also want to make sure are functioning properly. Perfect example, I was at a place a couple months ago where they had these devices, but for whatever reason, the door didn't swing shut on its own. the magnet was working properly, it was tied in, but the self-closing mechanism was not functioning properly. Okay. Those that are familiar with life safety know that the NFPA puts out a life safety code. And I typically try not to quote directly from them, but I think it's important to emphasize for those that don't have an existing understanding of how NFPA works, it's important to understand that anything put out by them is simply a consensus standard until it's actually adopted by the authority having jurisdiction, or AHJ. Now, depending on the particular situation, the AHJ could be anyone from the city to the city fire department, to the fire marshal, to the insurance company. And if we're being completely honest here, a lot of times it's confusing. To muddy the waters even more is the fact that this authority having jurisdiction may not adopt the most recent version. So here we're looking at 2021. I've had some AHJs that adopt maybe the 2017 version of NFPA 101, but for something like fire alarms, they adopt the 2012 version, or they may adopt different versions, or excuse me, different aspects of one code over another. So it's important to at least have an understanding of that. It's when I've gotten asked which version a particular client is needing to know, and it's actually a lot of times it's not the easiest thing to find out, but and certainly it's frustrating on my end to try and figure out trying to address how convoluted some of these AHJs are as far as what they adopt. Now, a good example of some conflict, we'll get into this in a little more detail later. OSHA has actually adopted quite a bit of NFPA 101 into law. And this is, as you can tell, this is federal regulations. If you're in a place like California, there are probably state or local governments that may even have more stringent requirements that have adopted other standards or other versions of the standard. So it's important to have an understanding of how that works. We're not going to talk about all aspects of life safety code. Certainly the code itself is hundreds of pages. So we're really going to try to hit the high points. But as you can see here, the whole point of this, the whole point of life safety code is that we talk about prevention on the front end of things. Life safety code is on the back end. So stuff happens, there's a fire, people need to be able to get out safely and quickly. I do find that a lot of folks tend to really underestimate how important this is until there's actually an incident. And one of the case studies that I pulled, this is actually kind of near and dear to me since I was actually living in Chicago when this occurred in 2003. This was not even a fire per se. This was a club which they had an incident where there was a fight and it was broken up. The people who were in the fight were ejected. However, in the process of doing so, one of the security guards used pepper spray. That pepper spray got sucked up into the HVAC. Patrons that were nearest to the HVAC started exhibiting effects like vomiting and fainting, etc. And panic started to spread because we were still kind of coming out of 9/11, and there was the misconception that this was some sort of terrorist attack and there's a poison gas loose in the club. Now, unfortunately, it's a tragic example of what exactly happens when you have 1,500 patrons frantically trying to get through the only exit that is available. And as you can see here, not only was there only one exit for 1,500 people, the doors opened in the wrong direction. And while there were consequences, as you can see down here, this is something that never should have happened. This is actually club. Supposedly, the inspectors that do these sorts of inspectors within the city of Chicago had thought the nightclub was closed down and it was just the restaurant. It's probably a combination of incompetence and corruption. Big surprise that this sort of thing might happen in Chicago, I know. But certainly a lot of people, 21 people paid the ultimate price for that corruption and ineptitude. So as we kind of mentioned, this is actually becoming a very common sight in the past year as companies try to cope with social distancing requirements. I'm seeing more and more emergency exits getting blocked like this. As we kind of already alluded to in the case study, these need to be kept clear at all times. There needs to be an adequate number of designated emergency exits. Typically, that number is at least 2. However, depending on how, if you have a larger capacity room, there may be a need for more exits. However, those exits cannot be, you can't count those exits if they're right next to each other. So for example, and the reason for that is if you have a fire that blocks one of the exits, it's probably going to block the other exit too. So really you can't count them as 2 exits, it's only 1 exit. So now the exception to that might be maybe a 2-person office where the capacity is pretty straightforward, that you're not going to get that many people needing to go out the only exit. Now the walking surface itself has to be safe for travel, and by that I mean it has to be free of slipping hazards. It must be free from tripping hazards. Believe it or not, a 1/4 inch of elevation can really increase the chance of somebody tripping, and we want to make sure that and the whole point of these requirements is making sure that people are able to exit to safety without creating a greater hazard. So for just like that E2 nightclub, we didn't get into too much detail there, but the folks that had to exit, not only did the doors open the wrong way, they had to go upstairs. There was a big bottleneck. So we want, if we have an older building, if we have any reason to think that maybe for our particular occupancy this is not adequate, we want to take a closer look at that and possibly bring in someone from the fire department who's going to know what the minimal requirements are for that safe egress. As I already mentioned, as far as exits staying blocked, by the same token, they need to be unlocked anytime the building is occupied. This is a big no-no, and I haven't come across it as much lately, although it's conceivable that with COVID, this might be a more common sight. Like a lot of places, I haven't been out and about as much as in a normal year. Now, what we're trying to get at here is the door has to be able to, you have to be able to open the door without needing keys, without needing special knowledge. So really, when it comes to safe exit, really about the only locking device that would be acceptable is a deadbolt. Now, the other flip side to that might be a panic hardware like this. We've all seen these in movie theaters. Obviously, large capacity buildings like that. This is a good idea to have that. All it takes is a simple push to get it open. And just like along the same lines, it needs to be free of any device or alarm that can restrict emergency use. As you might imagine, though, correctional facilities are a great example where certain exceptions are made for some of this stuff. However, even if you're in that particular situation, there has to be a plan in place to remove occupants during an emergency like a fire. We already kind of mentioned that that the door, especially when you have a higher occupancy like 50 or more people or a high hazard area, needs to be able to swing in the direction of egress. So if again that pile up that we talked about with the E2 nightclub, that there's no way that should have occurred. And certainly I can understand how one day an exit might be blocked and another day it might be unblocked. However, generally speaking, most doors it takes a lot of doing to shift the way that they open. So it's certainly something that should have been caught and fixed long time ago. Right along those lines, the capacity of the route can't bottleneck. Side hinge doors need to be used. And I see this a lot with places that have garages. They want to count that overhead garage door as a designated exit. Most places that's not going to fly. There might be a way around that if you designate that garage door must be open at all times. The building is occupied and needs to be enforced, certainly. But again, you're starting to depend on human nature there, as opposed to having a hard and fast control feature. We talked a little bit about lighting. As you might imagine, the exit route doesn't do us a whole lot of good if we can't see where we're going. We want to make sure that they're clearly marked with exit, and that the exit signs are illuminated. Fortunately, with advances in lighting technology, I remember when I first started out, these exit signs were constantly burning out. It was definitely a complaint by pretty much every building owner that it is almost a full-time job to go around and make sure that all the light bulbs were working properly. Now we've kind of come a long way with the newer technology, whether we're talking about exit signs or emergency lighting. They don't tend to burn out as much. The batteries tend to last longer as well. Any doorway or passage that could possibly be mistaken if it's along the route of discharge, if it could be possibly mistaken for an exit, and that we want to make sure that particular door is labeled. And herein, and this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier, where you have a discrepancy with what is the actual required wording. So as an example, if we're referencing OSHA, they require that doorway or passage be labeled not an exit, whereas the newest version of NFPA requires that doorway or passage be labeled no exit. As far as I'm concerned, I've actually talked with a number of colleagues about this. I think we pretty much all agree that not an exit is a better way to articulate what we're trying to get across. But certainly, this is a perfect example of one of these discrepancies that we need to be aware of. As you might imagine, if we're talking about safe egress, that route itself has to be kept free of really any hazard. We're talking whether it be slip, trip, and fall, whether we're talking about highly flammable or explosive materials, whether we're talking about dangerous manufacturing processes. These should not, if we find that we have these hazards, then they need to be shielded or blocked off by suitable partitions or physical barriers. Certainly, if you have fall hazards, that guardrails must be used as well. I haven't come across exit routes that travel through a room that can be locked recently, although I have. Typically, when you find this, it's usually an older building and they have that route for whatever reason going through a bathroom. As you might imagine, that route can be locked and that exit is no longer valid. Okay. In order for an exit to actually be considered an exit and to actually be useful, it has to discharge to a street, a public way, or refuge area. So if you find one that discharges into, say, a yard that is gated and locked, that's not going to be a suitable exit discharge. So that's something that we want to address, whether that be a panic hardware on the gate itself or in some other fashion. As you might imagine, it has to be large enough to accommodate occupants. Those of us in cold weather states want to be aware of, and I used to see this quite a bit in Illinois, where I would open up an exit door to see where it discharged to, and there's about 3 feet of snow in my way. So as you might imagine, if that has to be used in an emergency, it's not going to do anybody really any good. We're not going to talk too much about alarms. There's a whole NFPA standard that covers this, but we want to at least be aware of some of the basic things. It has to be distinctive and recognizable above the ambient noise level we happen to be dealing with in that particular work area. It has to be distinctive, so For example, if it sounds the same as the horn that sounds when work begins, the shift begins and the shift ends, then that is not going to be useful to anybody. And certainly, if it goes without saying, and that the alarm system has to be operable. And I say that, but as I look at this picture over here, this picture was actually a hotel fire, and it started in the kitchen. Not only was the alarm not functioning properly, but they found several exits chained shut as well. Now, if for whatever reason we have an alarm that doesn't work properly, as part of our overall emergency action plan, we want to make sure that we have some sort of backup mechanism that's going to function, whether that be an assigned person that goes from department to department alerting people, whether we have some sort of other mechanism to make sure that people are notified that there's an evacuation that needs to take place immediately. We're not going to get too far into emergency action plan, but as you might imagine, that just like with any hazard, we want to make sure that people are trained on whatever responsibilities, whether that be rescue or medical. If we designate someone as the backup person to call in to the fire department, that we have a fire, we have an emergency, we want to make sure that they are properly trained on their responsibilities and that people know that is the designated person. We want to have procedures in place both for evacuation and for doing doing a head count after everyone is safely out of the building. We want to be able to present that immediately to emergency personnel. If there's someone that's missing for whatever reason, we want to be able to convey that to them immediately. Okay, now before we take questions, there's one last bit of shameless promotion here. I did mention that we're going to be doing a webinar on kitchen hazards. That will be yours truly. So if you'd like to attend for that, that will be coming up February 10th, and hopefully you'll be getting an alert for that as well if you're interested. Okay.
All right, so for our Q&A, it looks like we had a couple questions that came in. The first one was, can I be cited by OSHA or other authority for having the incorrect sign stating no exit versus not an exit?
Okay, good question. This has actually come up in the past when I've had this particular discussion, and certainly, I guess the short answer is technically yes, but as you know, again, we're talking about conflict of these particular authorities having jurisdiction. You know, if as long as you have some form of warning up there, that you're making a good faith effort to warn your employees that this is a dead end, this is not the way to get out of the building. I can't see them, you know, they may go ahead and cite you, but I would venture to speculate that it would be a fairly simple matter of disputing that and showing a good faith effort that, hey, you know, we are adhering to one or the other standard here. The intent is still the same, and we're trying to keep our employees safe. So I would certainly, if you do find yourself in that unfortunate situation, I would bring that good faith effort to the forefront.
All right, and we did have a couple more questions, but looks like we're running out of time here. So we'll go ahead and email those people with answers to those questions. Okay. And our next webinar is February 10th. This one will be on kitchen hazards and fire suppression systems. And the invitation for that email will be sent out on February 3rd, a week before that webinar. And if you're not currently on the mailing list to receive those webinar notifications and invites, you can email us at riskcontrol@alliant.com, and we will gladly go ahead and add you to the list so you can receive those reminders. And I want to go ahead and thank Mark for the great presentation, and also thank everyone for joining us today. We hope this presentation has been beneficial for you and your staff. And if you missed any portion of it, the link to the recorded webinar will be emailed this afternoon.
Thank you all and stay safe.